welcome to Dialogue. The second International Forum on Democracy, the Shared Human Values, concludes in Beijing to explore the essence and development of democracy and calls for the upholding of common values. Is there a one-size-fits-all model for democracy? How well can countries with different values get along? To answer these questions, I'm very honored to be joined by Dr Pornchai Danvivathana, Secretary General of Asian Cooperation Dialogue. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion, Pornchai. When we talk about democracy, I wonder what's your interpretation of democracy, as a shared value for humankind? In particular, is there a universal, one-size-fits-all model of democracy?
Well, thank you for the question. To me, it's subject to interpretation. Like other universal values that you mentioned, for example, human rights, there is no one-size-fits-all, and it's subject to interpretation. Of course, as long as people are content with the administration or political system that they are living with, I think it's fine.
And do you think, people's understanding in terms of region, in terms of countries, for example, do you see a difference in their understanding between, for example, Westerners or people in Asian countries in terms of democracy?
I think, again, it's subject to interpretation. One may have its own model as long as it satisfies the constituents. And secondly, it should come from within, not be imposed by others.
You delivered a speech in February at the UN saying that UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, are the blueprint for peace and prosperity. And then you also expressed your concern about the gap between countries' developments and also the digital divide, which is increasing. Tell us more on that. Because
it's the common concern or issue, particularly for developing countries and also LDCs. Secondly, I think that even after pandemic, we need to collaborate more. That is why we talk more about multilateralism, so that countries could join hands together in order, again, as SDG always refer to, not to leave anyone behind.
At a press conference in February, the Chinese Foreign Minister Qin Gang, stressed that a Cold War or big power competition should not emerge in the Pacific region, and ASEAN countries should not be pressured to take sides, either with China or with the US. How do you see, Minister Qin's remarks?
Well, I cannot speak for any country or any blocs, but what I can say is that we should not make any corner of the world be an area of conflict, but try to resolve discrepancies or differences by peaceful means and allow diplomacy to take its course. Mm-hmm. So you asked me about the remarks of the foreign minister. I think this is one that we should take into account, and it applies to all areas in the world, not only in ASEAN. But for ASEAN, as far as I'm concerned, we always refer to ASEAN centrality, that ASEAN should take the lead and also come into being and try to resolve any differences to the extent possible.
Mm-hmm. Can we say that most of the countries, including ASEAN, most of the Asian countries in Asia Pacific region, let's say their priority is really about the cooperation, in particular in trade, investment, or personnel exchanges, because that helps with development, economic and social development. They have little interest in geopolitical competition, big power competition. Can we say that's basically the consensus for most of the countries?
I think so. I think so. And we need to tackle a lot of pressing issues, including new challenges like climate change and also SDGs that we, if not all, but most of us or many of us are quite behind.
We see globalization is sort of, some people would say there is a retreat of globalization, but at the same time we do see there's probably the rise or development of regionalization or regional trade. For example, this RCEP that includes both China and ASEAN countries, as well as Australia and New Zealand, for example. Do you agree there's regionally economic integration is still growing?
I think so, and I think it's a common phenomenon because globalization is something that may face hiccups from time to time, but we should see the benefit of globalization, and I think China is one that makes the best use of globalization. How poverty in China has been lifted is because of globalization and also international trade. So this is something we can look into seriously, and perhaps it can be a kind of case study for others.
Thank you, Pornchai. You're watching Dialogue. Coming up, we'll talk to Dr. Yonas Adaye, former director of the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University. Welcome back. Since the national independence and the liberation movements of the 1960s, some African countries have been adopting the Western democratic model. But has Western democracy brought economic prosperity and social stability to these African countries? And how does the continent view China's democratic model, which is based on its national conditions? To find out more, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Yonas Adaye, former director of the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University. Welcome to the discussion, Dr. Adaye.
Thank you.
So, we start with the Chinese style democracy or the whole process, people's democracy. You have been to China for several times. Share with us your understanding of the Chinese democracy.
I focused on 4 points there. One was participation, people's participation. Second was context specificity. And the third was communality, the common. How people coming together based on Africa's philosophy of Ubuntu, which says, I am because we are. And the fourth one is working democracy. So I can see these four in this whole people's democracy, this holistic approach to democracy in Chinese interpretation. So I immediately was very much surprised to find myself the thought in Africa practiced in China, because we always believe in communality, community coming together, communality. So that communality, the theoretical aspect we have in proverbs, in sayings. For instance, one proverb from Kenya is, eat with your neighbors. So you can see this one in practice. The whole approach to democracy, the holistic approach, I would say, because the whole approach, whole people's democracy, to me, honestly speaking, very working. Why working? Because it is tested in practice. Look at what happened 30 to 40 years in China. 800 million people being extricated, uplifted from poverty. Which country in history has ever done such social transformation? I don't call it revolution, transformation, to be honest. Yes. So my understanding of Chinese democracy then is a working democracy, people-centered development democracy.
Looking from outside at the Chinese democratic process, how do you characterize this practice? Obviously it is different from, say, Western style democracy.
I would say it's fundamentally different from the West, because what I can see in China is walking the talk. And in the West, I can see it nominally there. They would tell you about human rights. But if you take a person called George Floyd, because he was black, I can't breathe. So the human rights, even to live, to life, his right to life was deprived, then they would be talking about human rights. As I and you speak here, the 20th anniversary of Iraqi invasion by the US, particularly by the US and of course Western ally, being celebrated. But look at what happened to Iraq today. So you call it human rights. There was no weapon of mass destruction at all. Just going and invading, and then you call yourself democratic, someone respecting human rights. So when you compare democracy in the West and democracy in China, honestly speaking, the democracy in China is honestly walking the talk. It is based on merit, meritocracy, as some people like to call it, a working democracy. You can truly, I was walking in the midnight yesterday to buy some things for my children. I was not afraid of anything. If I were somewhere else, I don't have to mention the name of a country. To be honest, because of my color, I keep on, because of the security, mind you. I completely felt secured and safe here. So you can see democracy in terms of security, democracy in human rights, so particularly democracy in terms of development, and most important, food security or poverty alleviation. These 4 points are, you can see in practice in China. Come to China and see it. I'm just speaking what I saw. I'm not simply telling what I have read, but what I have seen in China. By the way, this is my 11th time to come to China. I kept on coming, going. I had also a class in Shanghai, African security class. I had to talk to my students clearly, openly. And each and every country has their own historical context, cultural values. So Chinese democracy is based on Chinese values, Chinese philosophy, particularly Confucius philosophy. It bases on, as African democracy focuses on communality, Chinese democracy focuses on people, belief system. So this is what I saw.
Yeah, you mentioned meritocracy. Yes. For those who are not familiar with the Chinese system, China sometimes, would say, the promotion or the selection or election of officials is based on track record. It's based on your past performance, in previous job, your previous position. Tell us more about meritocracy. What is it and how it works in China?
My understanding of the current leader, I had to read his biography when he was in very remote rural areas, working with farmers down there, and then based on that, in some other, so he had to be promoted because he was tested as I test my students. I'm a teacher professionally. I've been trained to be a teacher, and every student is assessed according to their performance before they are to be promoted to the next grade. In the same way, I happen to see the way you elect leaders based on their best performance, how much they have done politically, economically, and most important, socially, how they're responding to social questions, social quests. And for the areas they were assigned to administer and lead, this is what I saw up from poverty. A small book written by, of course, Xi Jinping. It's a lovely book. I've been making reference to my PhD students as well to have a look at, and fair comparison between Western democracy or liberal democracy and that of functional working democracy in China. So in the same way, when I see those things, when people really are judged not by their color, not by their race, their religion, but their performance, by their work, quality of their work, quality of their thinking, quality of their planning, then I call that one is a true democracy because it's based on merit-based democracy, or meritocracy as we
Meritocracy. Yeah, you mentioned a very interesting point. Some say the Chinese culture or the Chinese practice, stress very much about the result or results-oriented work, government work, and the outcome is important. It's not only about the procedure. So some people would say, oh, the Chinese democracy is more about substance, and the Western-style democracy stress more about procedure. Do you think there's a point?
There is a huge point, to be honest. I did my PhD in Great Britain, in the UK, at the University of Bradford. And I had an opportunity to look at Yorkshire area, people in Western Yorkshire particularly. The difference, class difference, is really appalling, to be honest. And sometimes you really feel that as if you were even a third world country rather than first world country, to be honest. Because of the system, you may have the procedure you can see in different media, time and again, human rights, inclusivity, democracy, those positive responses, affirmative action. These are all terminologies, very colorful terminologies are there. When you go and talk to Asian community in Bradford, from Pakistan or from Afghanistan, we talk to your friends, because they were my classmates there when I was in Bradford. You really can see a difference. What's been said and what's been practiced are different. So it is not substance, but procedure I saw in the Western world, as I saw it practically. In the reverse order, when you come to China, just like Ethiopian saying, we say in Ethiopia, you don't have to talk, show us. So you can just see it rather than hear it. So the substance, that is alleviation, poverty. Let me just make it very clear. In 1961, China's GDP and Kenya's GDP were equal, $1,500 per capita. Now compare after this 40 years, 1961, now 2021, that of 2023 even, that of Kenya and China. In China, nearly 30,000 USD, and still it's below 2,000 in Kenya, quantitatively, if you like to make. The same is true in Ethiopia. The same is true almost across Africa. So this substantive, this based on substance change, economic change, poverty change, life quality change, level of happiness, happiness index, if you really look at China. It is because of your delivering democracy, because of your meritocracy, based on performance-based democracy, you are bringing qualitative change. So Western democracy, yes. Into style, into speeches, yes. Substance, delivering, changing people's lives, transforming society, it is in China, of course. So this is the quality that I can see in China here. It is working, not only working for China, I'm sure others also can not copy but learn from Chinese experience as well. So you have a lot, you are not talking, but you are working. And that is a fundamental difference here.
Fundamental differences. Speak of that, you talked about, U.S. invasion of Iraq 20 years ago. Of course, the reasons they given includes like weapons of mass destruction, and also justification points to the plant of the seed of democracy. And then that is, of course, people say that is the attempt by some Western countries to impose their model of democracy onto other countries. The Chinese are not happy with that. Many people have an issue with imposing. It's like there's one universal model of democracy. Like every country should copy this model. If there's anything about the Chinese model, that's their emphasis on. There's no universal model of democracy. Every country probably needs to adopt to their own national conditions to find their path of development. Is that the case?
That's the beauty of Chinese governance system, to be honest. The very governance system itself, focusing on the context. As I come here today with you, a guest here on interview in CGTN. As I go back to my family, I'm a father to my children, I'm a husband to my wife. As I go to my parents, I'm their child. Because of context, one person having different meanings. In the same way, democracy depends upon context, social context, cultural values. Chinese democracy does not preach, take my way, no. If there is a lesson to learn, you can learn from us. That's absolutely excellent. So, yes, context is decisive. People, if they want to learn, say for instance, merit-based approach is better, then they can do that, they can try. And if value-based, culture-based democracy, not simply copied and pasted democracy, or not dictated democracy, or not democracy as a condition to get aid or loan from China, then it doesn't work. But what works is according to the context of those specific countries, and then definitely that's why the beauty of Chinese governance is not to impose on you, but to work together, emerge winners both, that's win-win approach. And finally, if there is a lesson to be learned which works for all humanity, not only one country or one system, but the entire society, then because you are offering choice, alternatives, that to me, that is a true human-to-human relation, which promotes finally even the Chinese governance system as well. People might possibly consider learning a lesson and applying in their own countries according to their concrete context.
Exactly. Speak of that, of course, if you look at, African countries, in the 1960s, the independence and liberation movement, after that, many countries adopt, in a sense, the Western style of democracy. How do you think, democracies work in African continent nowadays?
Let's be really fair to African situations. Africans really is not by their choice that they adopted that Western democracy, because if they want a loan or aid, they were given two conditions. One, liberalize your economy, democratize your politics. So liberalize.
It's kind of being
conditioned.
Conditioned.
It was imposed on them, they forced it. What happened? What was the result? In 1980s, SAP, Structural Adjustment Program, started with World Bank, with IMF, with the Western package. Some countries were made to produce cotton, others were asked to do this and that. And finally, after 10 years, everything went down in the spiral. Complete failure. Because it was imposed. It didn't evolve from below. It was imposed from above. It does not reflect, it didn't reflect Africa's context, Africa's concrete social values. It is just Western. So as it came from outside, it went back. And Africa went back again to poverty. That's why I was comparing 40 years ago and 40 years later between the two countries, China and Kenya, because of the data I have, of course. I would have compared with many, with Ethiopia, with Liberia, with many others, almost the same. So, because the Western democracy was dictated from above, in order to receive aid, get some loan, get some scholarship, then the countries were imposed to exercise democracy, which is imposed from outside. Finally, it didn't lead them anywhere, from poverty back to poverty even. But the poor got poorer, rather than developing even further.
Now, there's another issue, of course, I also want to have your opinion on this report published recently by the Chinese side called The State of Democracy in the U.S. 2022, where the Chinese side criticized the U.S. for framing a narrative of democracy versus autocracy, authoritarianism, labeling countries as autocracy. Chinese side said that is, basically to divide the world based on ideology or use the value issue, democracy as a wedge, basically. to advance Washington's geostrategy under the disguise of democracy. What do you make of that?
Some countries, particularly the US and others, if you don't go with them, you are against them. No. You may not love me, but you can be neutral. You don't have to like me necessarily. We can respect each other, we can live together.
Can get along.
Absolutely, we can get along. Yeah, absolutely. So this black and white, if you are not with me, you are against me, is a dangerous thing. Not at all. So the same, anyone who is not, my style of democracy is autocratic. To me, I think it requires thinking again, revisiting, thinking more critically. Difference is not enmity. Difference is given by nature. If we look at our own fingers, tall, small, it's serious, natural, we're different.
Right.
If you look at our geography here, it's going outside, you can see some mountains up there, river far away here, and you can see this is naturally there. So because you are different from me, I should not label you as you are autocratic, I'm democratic. No. Who should tell about who is democratic and who is not democratic?
Exactly.
Number one, the people themselves, of each country. Really, what are the black people saying? Why Black Lives Matter come out in America? Why is it? How many people really would tell you they're suffering from lack of the basic necessities? Right. So we have so many things to say, but simply put, I think they really have to revisit their areas of understanding. And I definitely tend, after having read the report, to me it is really fair. And interfering in other countries' affairs. We ourselves in Ethiopia, we faced a lot of problems. Intervention from the West directly in the internal affairs of Ethiopia. But now, thank God Almighty, African-led solution for African problems, we are gradually resolving them. So rather than helping resolve problems, resolve conflicts, I think it's not wise to create conflicts or demonize people and countries, and at the same time even talk about them badly. I think these are, in this 21st century, it's time to cooperate, because look at now what's happening to the environment. We have only one planet, Earth, nothing else. So we are destroying the war in Ukraine, for instance. If you look at the living things in ocean and air and the trees, they are suffering because of the consequence of this war itself. So why we should work together rather than really working against each other, and particularly characterizing others as devils or demons because they don't agree with me, to me is not acceptable, not good behavior for international diplomacy as well as international relations, and that's really what I can say now.
Thank you, Dr. Adeto.
Thank you very much indeed.
With that, we come to the end of today's discussion. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.